"Who's that then?" she asked, rather confused. "Old George, is it?" the inspector asked. "Oh, him," Mavis chuckled, a little embarrassed. "Yes, he doesn't like a storm. It always seems to upset him, so he was busy last night." She spoke of the unearthly visitor as if he were a member of the family. "Well, let's hope the worst has been and gone. Does old George often make himself known if there's a storm?" "Oh, yes, all the commotion, you see, keeps him up." Mavis was pleased to have someone new to tell about him. Everyone else had heard her stories 100 times and believed her a little less with every retelling. Drew could hardly believe the inspector was really interested and wondered what he really wanted to know. Poor old George, eh? The inspector was empathetic. "Was there anything else you noticed last night? Anyone in you don't usually see?" Mavis thought for a moment, replaying the evening over in her head. "No, Inspector, nothing comes to mind immediately," she replied, pondering. "What about your clocks? All telling the right time this morning?" Mavis thought for a moment at the strange question, then glanced behind the bar. "Well, what time do you make it?" she asked him. 10 to 1, he replied. Mavis squinted at the old clock behind the bar. "That one says 5-2, she told him, then checked the small-faced watch on her wrist. "Same as mine." She clicked the winding mechanism out and put it back 5 minutes. "Why do you ask?" she wondered. "Oh, just on a whim. I noticed they were fast is all. I'm a punctual sort of fellow." "I see," she replied politely, not really seeing the relevance. "Well, if you think of anything, let me know," the inspector asked her. "Yes, of course," she replied seriously. There was a moment where time seemed to hang, as if George himself had come to listen. Mavis came back to herself with a smile, and she noticed Drew lean back in his chair and rub his belly appreciatively. "Now, will you still be wanting your sandwiches?" she asked. "Oh, I certainly will, though I daren't speak for my colleague. What do you think, Drew? Would a sandwich be too much on top of the chicken and leek?" "Perhaps not quite yet, Mavis. Give me 5 minutes to let the soup go down." "As you wish, love," she replied, and bustled off with the bowls. The inspector turned back to Drew. "What's all the business with old George, then?" Drew asked quietly, when she was out of earshot. "Surely you can't be interested in Mavis's old ghost stories?" The inspector shrugged. "I'm interested in discovering the reasons behind Mr. Barrow appearing in the copse," he replied casually. "Anything that happened at the time of the body's appearance that might be considered strange or out of place could give us a clue, no matter how unlikely it might sound," he informed him. "I doubt very much there is a ghost haunting this pub, but there might be something else causing the disturbance, and who knows how it could be connected," the inspector asked rhetorically. "And what about the time?" Drew asked. "That wasn't on a whim, was it?" "Well, that's something I noticed with the Major. The clock in his car was 17 minutes fast. I'm still trying to work out why." He pulled his notebook out and scribbled a few things down. "Well, you're the inspector," Drew acknowledged, trusting the man's method. "So what did you make of the map, Drew?" the inspector asked, changing the subject. They leant forward to examine it together. "I presume these numbers are readings from the instruments you were using earlier." Drew pointed to where the inspector had noted them on the map. He followed their trail around, pausing to consider the notations and crosses that the inspector had neatly marked in various places. The inspector remained silent, allowing him to consider their meanings. "This cross refers to where I discovered the body. This one to the Firestone on the roundabout. This is the route taken by the Major." Drew traced the line down the main road with his finger. "And these numbers are the times and dates." "Very good," the inspector was impressed. "There are increased levels of pressure along these lines. Very odd, very small differences, but they are there. I want to see how far out they extend," the inspector explained. "Why, what does it have to do with how the body got there?" Drew asked, unable to see the connection. "How it is connected to that I don't know. I have to follow all lines of investigation open to me, and in a case like this there aren't many. I hope any relevance they hold, or not, as the case might be, will be identified as the investigation continues," the inspector explained. He turned back to the map. "I'd like to go here." He motioned on the map a place where the east to west line interceded with the main road. "Here?" Again, the line and road crossed. Drew read the map and guessed where he might want to visit next. "And here?" he asked, recognising the pattern, taking a chance. "Yes, indeed. Good man. I'll have to get readings at each spot to see what we can find." "Well, they're a bit of a way out. It will be a long drive," Drew warned him. "Yes, you're right," the inspector conceded. "Before we do that, then, we need to visit your Sergeant Banks and see what he has to say about his actions last night." Drew shuddered a little at the thought of Banks. The inspector was thoughtful as he planned out all the things he needed to do. "I would like to pay a visit to our fatality to see if Dr. Ward has discovered something while inspecting the body that might throw some light on the reasons for his appearance." The inspector thought these words over for a moment, then checked his watch. "Though I doubt we will have time to reach the hospital today." "Dr. Ward?" Drew asked. "Yes, a colleague of mine, a mortician from Scotland Yard. If I'm honest, I suspect that any clues the good doctor discovers will raise more questions than they answer." Drew frowned, and Mavis reappeared with their sandwiches. "What do you think, Drew? Ready for the next course?" the inspector asked as he spied the plates making their way to the table. "My, I'm not sure yet." "No matter, I certainly am." Mavis placed the plates down and put a napkin next to each of them, as she had done with the soup. The inspector's eyes widened in anticipation at the thickly sliced white bread and the generous filling. "If these sandwiches are half as good as your soup, I shall have to start eating all my meals here," he commented, as Mavis checked the table to ensure she hadn't forgotten anything. She chuckled at him appreciatively. "Now, I haven't brought your tea as yet. I didn't think you'd want it with your soup. Would you like it now?" she asked. "Well, that was most thoughtful of you. Yes, a cup now would be nice. I wonder, are the chips ready yet?" the inspector ventured politely. "Oh, my word, you do have a good appetite, don't you?" she chuckled with a shake of her head. "They're just cooking now. I'll bring them out as soon as they're done, my love." "That is most kind, thank you," the inspector replied, and as she bounced back to the kitchen, he attempted to squeeze the doorstep of a sandwich into his mouth. He managed to take a large bite and brushed the crumbs from his moustache as he chewed. Drew could only watch and wonder. "You must have hollow legs, Inspector," Drew commented with a smile. The inspector swallowed. "What's that?" he asked, before taking another monstrous bite. Mavis returned, humming a quiet tune to herself and balancing a pot and some cups on a tray. "Here you are. Everything all right?" she asked. "Wonderful, thank you," the inspector replied at the end of his mouthful. "Glad to hear it. Chips won't be long," she informed them before scurrying back off to the kitchen. "Sorry, what did you say, Drew?" the inspector asked before continuing to eat his sandwich. "It's something my mother always says when I've eaten a big meal. You must have hollow legs." "Ah, yes, I see. You'll have to excuse my appetite. I tend to go for long periods of time without food, so when I get the opportunity to eat, especially when the food is as good as this, I stock up." He took another bite, and Drew gave in to temptation and took a mouthful of his. "So when did you last eat?" Drew asked through his mouthful. "About 5:30 this morning, just before starting on my journey here," the inspector replied carefully through his mouthful of sandwich. He was aware that although the murmur in the pub had returned to a more relaxed and natural level, the locals still regarded him cautiously, catching glimpses when they thought he wasn't looking, sneaking a look from the corner of an eye. He was aware of it, but pretended he was not. "No wonder you're so hungry. You should have said. I would have prepared you something at mine." "A very kind gesture, Drew, and perhaps I will take you up on the offer another time." He pushed the last mouthful of bread into his mouth and chewed. "Quite delicious," he said, taking a grateful swig of tea. A few eyes around the pub watched as the inspector wiped the last few crumbs of sandwich from his bushy moustache. Mavis reappeared with a plate of chips in her hand and a bottle of tomato ketchup under her arm. "Here you are then, gents. Hope you've still got room left for these." They thanked her and tucked in, the inspector liberally covering them in salt and pepper from the pots on the table. They made short work of them, the inspector doing most of the eating. They sat and drank their tea and let their food go down for a few minutes. "Are you ready for the off, do you think?" the inspector asked when the pot was emptied. Drew nodded with a satisfied smile. "I'll just settle up and then we should be off." The inspector stood and made his way over to Lionel. "I must congratulate your wife on a fine meal, sir," he addressed Lionel, who looked up from his paper as he approached. "And I must congratulate you on eating so much, Inspector. We had a sweepstake going to see if you would actually finish it all." The inspector chuckled. "I hope I didn't leave you out of pocket?" he asked with a smile. "No, sir, I was backing you all the way." He began pushing numbers into his till. Numbers popped up behind a glass enclosure on top. "So that comes to 13 shillings and sixpence, if you please." The inspector produced a leather wallet and handed over 14 shillings. "Please keep the change and give Mavis my best. I hope to dine here again before I leave." Lionel's eyes widened at the generous tip. "Well, you're always welcome here, Inspector." The tin opened with a worn-out ping from its bell, and Harold deposited the notes. Drew stood by the door and handed the inspector his coat. "Thank you, Drew. Now, perhaps we should visit Sergeant Banks." "Of course, Inspector." Drew opened the door for him. The inspector raised his hat to the locals as they cast one last analytical eye over him. "Until the next time," he called, before leaving them all in a stupefied silence. Chapter 15. The hearty meal gave Drew energy he had been lacking after his difficult night. The fine food was, he decided, exactly what he had needed, and they made short work of the walk to Firestone police station. The building was simple enough, a red brick house near the end of a row of identical terraces. The only thing that differentiated it from the others was the blue lamp outside the door with "Police" written in white on all four sides. Drew and the inspector entered the small station through the front door, the public entrance. Inside, the difference between the station and an ordinary house was more pronounced. They entered a small room, painted clinically white and sparsely decorated with a few notices giving advice to the public about the importance of locking their doors at night and other such matters. It was furnished only with an uncomfortable-looking wooden bench against one of the walls. Set into the wall at the far end was a hatch with a sliding window, and to the right was a door. Behind the window sat a colleague of Drew's with his head resting lazily on his hand. His arm was perched on the desk in front of him, and he peered down through thick glasses at his book. So engrossed was he that he didn't notice the two men enter the station until they were level with his window. He carefully, and with no sign of urgency, placed the open book down onto the table in front of him. "Well, Drew, who have you brought us this time?" the desk sergeant asked, looking the inspector up and down over his lenses and trying to calculate what crime he might be accused of. "This is the inspector, Tom, down from Scotland Yard," Drew informed him gently. He knew Tom would be as keen to have the inspector here as Banks was. The constable continued to look him up and down in disdain. "Is that right, is it?" he replied. "And I suppose he's here to be answering all the questions about that body you found, then, is he?" The man still addressed Drew as if the inspector wasn't there. He was condescending, not even attempting to hide his dislike of having someone from the capital meddling in Firestone's affairs. "Well, we would hope so, wouldn't we, Sergeant? After all, it would appear you've got your hands full manning the front desk," Drew replied. Far from being annoyed, the man tittered quietly to himself patronisingly. "I suppose you'd be wanting to come in, then?" Tom made to raise himself from his chair, making it clear in his forced movements and slow reaction that he was unhappy at being disturbed. "Indeed," the inspector addressed him. "We're here to see Sergeant Banks, and we would like to see him some time today." He spoke politely, with a gentle authority, and Tom found himself huffing out of his chair as quickly as he could to let him in. The inspector didn't have time for arguments with the local force. He found that combating the fights they tried to pick with a smile and manners made them feel they had won and got them on to doing their job quicker. "Course you are. Banks is in his office," Tom told them defensively. A few moments later, the adjoining door opened and he reappeared through it. He was shorter than the hatch revealed, and much rounder in the belly. He stood in silence as they entered, and as soon as both men were through, he closed the door and locked it again, then shuffled back to his seat. The door opened onto a corridor. Immediately on the left was a doorway that led to the small office and reception desk where Tom had resumed reading. The inspector followed Drew up the thin corridor to the main office of the police station. It was completely deserted. 3 desks sat empty between the sparse grey walls, slowly disappearing under paperwork. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, upon which sat folders gathering dust. The posters on the walls were frayed and brown, and a poorly-looking spider plant sat by the window gasping for water. The inspector glanced round the place disapprovingly before he rounded on the closed door to Banks's office. "Shall we see if he's in?" the inspector suggested, and gave the door 2 sharp knocks, causing the sound of movement to suddenly come from inside. The door opened and the figure of Banks appeared through it. "Drew!" he exclaimed excitedly. "It's good to see you finally. Come in, lad, and sit down." Banks began clearing a space in his office for the two of them to take a seat. Drew tried to hide his surprise at Banks's friendly reception. "Inspector, any news on the body? Any identification?" Banks asked as he shifted the contents of his desk from many small piles to one precariously high one. "Yes, I have identified him. He's not a local man. He is from Swindon. He has been taken to the hospital in Ethelwood for an autopsy, and when they have been found he will be reunited with his family for a proper burial," the inspector informed him matter-of-factly. "So it's nothing to do with Firestone Copse?" Banks asked. The inspector heard in his voice the hope that he would be leaving him and the town alone. "No, the victim was not from here, though I believe the reason for his appearance in Firestone to be related to the town in some way, and that is why I'm continuing my investigations." Banks nodded in understanding, a little too enthusiastically. His eyes widened a little at the news. He breathed a heavy sigh and looked at Drew. "You look very tired, Sergeant," the inspector pointed out. "Course I look tired. I was out all night trying to find young Drew here. Worried sick I was." His face was eager yet drawn. He looked directly into the inspector's eyes, and the inspector found he was warming to him, despite himself. "Let's not forget why he was out there in the first place. You sent him out to do the job of the council workman," the inspector reminded Banks and himself. "Did you attempt to contact them?" He remained impassive and businesslike, but whenever he looked into his eyes, he got the feeling that Banks was being wronged somehow. "Yes, I called Harry from this very telephone," he defensively pointed to the telephone on his desk. "He's the roadsman over in Biddlecombe. He moved there from Firestone 2 years ago when he got made head of roads for the county. He told me that all the vans were already out clearing the roads because of the storm, but he would let them know and send someone over, but he couldn't say when that would be." To Drew the alibi sounded rehearsed, and he blurted it out as if he had been waiting to be questioned on it. Drew was shocked, and a little disappointed to see the inspector nodding sympathetically. When I realised how bad the conditions were, well, I was worried sick about Drew, poor lad stuck out there all by himself. Especially with finding a body like that, it wasn't safe for him out there, so I drove round looking for him. The inspector had removed his notebook and had begun to make notes. I see. And when Drew originally called you about the body, what did you advise him to do? Banks turned from the inspector to Drew. Drew, I wanted you to come back for your own safety. There wouldn't be much you could do out there all night by yourself. I thought bringing the body back would be the best in those conditions, he said firmly. I thought it might be best to get the body back, so that we could preserve any evidence that might be left on it. In that way, that any clues might easily have been washed away. The tone was sincere. He was convincing the inspector that his concern for Drew was genuine, and he even found himself believing that returning the body would be the best thing to do. What made you choose Drew for the job? The inspector asked. Banks stared deep into the inspector's eyes, and he felt him penetrating his mind. There was something about the way he was looking at him, something about his eyes, which made the inspector feel that he could have told him anything, and he would have believed it. Well, he's been a real asset to the force. You only have to see his record over the 2 years to see that. He's reliable and properly suited to life as a rural policeman. Yes, well, really, that's how you should be describing any policeman working in these communities. Why send Drew? It was a hard job shifting a tree, Banks replied slowly, looking deep into the inspector's eyes. The inspector felt as though Banks was trying some trick on him and resisted it fiercely. Yes, I'm sure. Why not the chap on the front desk? The inspector asked. Tom? He's not much good to anyone when he's on duty, let alone off, Banks joked, trying to keep the atmosphere jovial. Or one of the other constables? Drew asked. Banks gritted his teeth. Well, he told them both gently, Drew is the only constable I have that would be up to it. It was the truth, but it was hard for him to admit it. The Firestone force was ageing. And so where were you last night when the body appeared? The inspector asked. I was having dinner with some friends, he replied, looking into the inspector's eyes again. The inspector's questions were not phrased accusingly, and Banks's answers were slow and deliberate, as if answering a child. Whereabouts? Can I have a list of names of the friends you were with? The inspector asked nicely. Drew was a little concerned at the inspector's tone. Was he falling under Banks's spell, as the rest of the town had? Really, Inspector, do you suspect me? Banks was incredulous at the suggestion that he would have to prove his whereabouts. No, of course not, the inspector heard himself saying. He then wondered what effect the sergeant was having on him and checked himself. I need to ascertain everyone's whereabouts, Sergeant Banks. I won't know who the right person to suspect is until I find someone with no alibi. Banks snorted derisively. Is it a problem for you to supply me with a list of names? The inspector asked in reply. Drew noticed the inspector battling with Banks's answers, unsure of his replies or how to talk to him. I suppose not, he conceded, almost triumphantly, knowing he could not possibly be a subject of investigation. He took a pen and paper from a drawer and wrote down 4 names, which he gave to the inspector. The inspector studied the names on the paper for a moment, then folded it and placed it into a pocket inside his jacket. Thank you. Well, I think that answers all the questions I have for now. I trust we can find you here, should I need you. The inspector stood. Drew wondered if he was perhaps being allowed to get away without being properly questioned. Of course. Are you still basing things over in Nettlewood? Banks asked hopefully. For now, they have a more active staff. They stood and left Banks sitting in his office. The inspector not so much closed the door behind him as slammed it firmly. Banks got the meaning. Stay where I can find you. Chapter 16. Banks' eyes thinned and he winced in disgust at his own behaviour. It hadn't been easy toadying to them. He had been preparing himself mentally for it all morning. He sat motionless for a few minutes, staring at the door. The clock on the wall ticked its way around mercilessly. He was unsure if his tricks had worked on him. He was stronger-willed than the fools that filled Firestone, he realised to himself. All he had to do with them was look deep enough into their eyes until he found their minds. He could find them and use what he hid deep down to persuade them to his way of thinking. Of course they do, he muttered to himself quietly. He sat motionless in the darkening room, listening, thinking. In the darkest recesses of his mind, a voice tried to break the silence. They won't believe you, it screamed over and over again. Banks could barely hear it. The voice was buried too deep. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his metal desk and pulled it open to relieve a packet of cigarettes, an ashtray, and a bottle of cheap scotch. He pulled out the scotch, ripped off the lid, and took a long, hard swig straight from the bottle. "Maybe you're right," he told the unseen visitor, his voice thick with menace and mirth. The voice fell silent. Something about the way Banks uttered the words filled the air with fear. He lit a cigarette, taking a long, slow pull. He let out a massive cloud of smoke. He took his time in the silence, allowing the meaning of the words to vibrate around his mind. They don't believe you. He tried to fathom all the possibilities, allowing their inevitable consequences to come to the fore before realizing what he had to do. The voice cowered in the abyss, not wanting to know, hidden deep in the dark. Banks took another swig from the whiskey, then reached into the back of the drawer and removed a hidden revolver and a packet containing 24 rounds of ammunition. He placed the gun and the bullets down on the desk for a moment and looked at them as though any moment they would spring to life. When he seemed pleased enough that they were real and that they weren't going to move, he slowly picked up the gun. He turned it over meticulously, a smirk lingering in an ugly corner of his mouth as he enjoyed the motions of loading it. When each chamber was loaded, he felt its weight in his hand. 3 fingers gripped about the handle, one poised over the trigger. He stared down the barrel, aiming it at the door, remembering how much he enjoyed using it. He reached for the cigarettes and lit another, the dimly lit room slowly filling with smoke. He did not relinquish the gun, but kept it in his hands, his eyes hardly leaving its dull grey metal. "He's getting too close. We need to stop him," he told the gun. He sat in silence for a minute or two as a darkness crept in around him. He could control most of the town, but for some reason he couldn't fathom the accursed Gates family were immune to him. That's why Drew's father had to go. That's why he had allowed Drew to come to Firestone, so he could keep a close eye on him. "Now that's true," he suddenly guffawed out loud to the smoky air. "Probably won't be the last neither." He laughed long and loud, taking another pull on the whiskey. "Well, we know what to do then, don't we?" he sneered, his eyes black and piercing through the dark. "We wait till he's all by himself. Then we takes care of him, don't we?" he asked the gun. "All we has to do is keep our heads down and wait for the right moment," he sneered, staring at the door, waiting. Chapter 17. Drew and the inspector left Sergeant Banks in his office and retraced their steps back through the police station. "Well," Drew said quietly when he was sure they were out of Banks' earshot, "that was the nicest he has ever been to me." He was surprised and disheartened. Banks' behaviour went against everything he had told the inspector. "Do you think his previous behaviour toward you may have been his attempt at nurturing your policing skills?" The inspector was impartial, investigative, and Drew was unsure by the tone in his voice what side he was taking. He hoped Banks hadn't got to him already. The inspector sensed the need to elaborate. "Some people find giving direct praise difficult. Perhaps by playing the role of the tough commanding officer, he was trying to encourage you, allowing you to grow confidence in your policing," the inspector suggested, then suddenly heard his own words and wondered what he was saying and why he would defend Banks over Drew. He reminded himself that Banks wanted to move the body, and that was enough to include him in his investigation. However, he had to admit that the urge to side with him had been strong, and he wondered at just what he was capable of and who he had managed to convince. The men reached the door and passed through without disturbing Tom from his book. Drew waited until they were through the waiting room, which was still empty, and out into the cold again before answering. "No, I'm only there to do his dirty work. It's like an old boys' club and I'm the new blood. I've been working hard to prove to them that I'm not going to stir the water and threaten the easy life they have made for themselves policing a town like Firestone." "And how did you do that?" the inspector asked. "I played the part of the slow constable. I did what I was told, but mostly I kept my mouth shut." As they walked back toward the town, the light of day was beginning to dull. Night was already gathering around the fringes of the horizon. "Is there much crime around here?" the inspector probed. Drew nodded. "Although Firestone is a sleepy place, things still happen that require investigation. The usual drill is to visit the house and interview the person reporting the crime, tell them that we would let them know of any developments, and that would be it. The case would be dropped. No further action would be taken. Sometimes they would chase us up, but we would easily talk our way out of it. That's a disgrace." "What sort of cases would you be called to?" the inspector asked as they walked. The shops loomed into view, all closing up, the butcher slowly and carefully removing his display of meat from the window. He nodded to them as they passed his window. There are all sorts really, Drew replied. Missing cats, damaged cars, stolen milk. The reports all got filed. I'm sure Banks has got them all somewhere. The inspector nodded. Yes, all important things to those who reported them, I'm sure. He could see Drew was capable of better, and that he'd spared at the way the police of Firestone treated the people they were there to protect. The inspector removed the list of guests from his pocket and read it out loud to Drew as they walked. So, yesterday, Sergeant Banks spent the evening at the mayor's house with Dr. Sparrow, Constable Atkins, and Charlie Hart. He looked the list up and down. Drew, who are they, and where can we find them? Drew leant over to see the list a little better. Well, the mayor lives up at the manor house just outside the town. A vicious man. He's very serious to his duty toward the town. Dr. Sparrow has his practice in Spencer Street. Family doctor, small family of his own. Constable Atkins is nice enough. His heart's in the right place, even if his mind isn't sometimes. Charlie Hart. Drew took a moment to try and place the name. The inspector was impressed with how much he knew about the men on the list. I wonder if that's Charlie from the Black Prince. That's Firestone's other pub. It's not as nice as the Green Man, he warned the inspector. Shame. Nonetheless, I think we should be paying it, and everyone else on this list, a visit. The inspector tucked the list back into his coat. Can you think of anything that might connect these men? Drew considered for a moment. Nothing comes to mind. Obviously the two coppers are connected. They all live in Firestone. Not sure if they have all been in Firestone their whole lives, so it wouldn't surprise me. They're all about the same age, so if they have been in Firestone all their lives, they probably went to school together. The two men fell in silence for a minute while they walked along in the chilling air. They approached Drew's house and the car parked outside. Well, your list of places to visit has become rather long. Where would you like to start? Drew asked, opening the passenger door for him. Well, I think we need to investigate these areas of interest I identified on the map first. That I hope will answer a few questions. We can leave the corroboration of Sergeant Banks' alibi until tomorrow, he informed Drew, noticing the darkening sky on the horizon. Of course. They climbed in, and the inspector took from his case the map they had been studying in the pub. He also removed one of his instruments and switched it on. It began emitting a series of clicks, and a green light blinked rather randomly. The inspector studied it closely, taking notes. What does that do? Drew asked, trying to think what it could be for. This device measures the electromagnetism in the atmosphere, the inspector explained. Its readings can vary depending on various factors, such as the weather. He looked out of the window at the grey murk that hung perpetually over their heads. However, the readings can also be affected when a source of magnetism disrupts the normal flow. A small needle on the dial, like that found on a set of scales, was wavering over the green light. The inspector held it by a wooden handle. A source of magnetism? Like a magnet? The inspector welcomed Drew's question. Yes, a magnet or a battery, all sorts of things. I'll calibrate it to take into account your car's engine. Turn the key and I'll show you. Drew obliged and brought the car's engine to life. The green, intermittent light became focused and bright. The needles rose quickly. Drew's eyes widened. Is that normal? He asked, trying to hide his worry. This is a normal reading for being sat in a running car, the inspector informed him, and then twiddled with a set of pegs at the back, as though he was tuning a musical instrument. With a few tweaks, the green light returned to the flicker that it had exhibited earlier, and the needle returned to its position. This, however, is not the average reading for your normal, everyday village. The inspector considered the wavering needle. It's a bit too high. This was an understatement, but he realised there was no need to alarm him. Drew looked at the green light, perplexed. What does it mean? He asked, fascinated. It means Firestone is not a normal, everyday village, the inspector replied. He turned his attention to the map. The car had begun to warm up with the engine running, and both began to thaw from the cold outside. Do you see this line? The inspector indicated the line that led east from the body and intersected with Nettlewood. Yes, Drew replied. There were readings I took while at the body that suggested a line of activity stretching north to south and east to west. This east to west line crosses a few places of potential interest in Nettlewood, namely this road here and these fields here that I showed you earlier. The inspector showed Drew places on the map that he had marked with an X. Shall we head for them now? Drew asked. Yes, please, the inspector replied, pulling on his seatbelt. Then we'll head back to the hotel. The day is drawing to a close. As you wish. Drew was still looking at the map. Perhaps if we start with those that are farther away, say this one, then this one. Drew indicated two X's that were a few miles apart along the Nettlewood Road on its southernmost border. Fine, the inspector complied. We could make our way over to this one before driving into Nettlewood itself and seeing this one, Drew suggested. Fine, the inspector replied. The route was the quickest way round by far, and the inspector was delighted in Drew's ability to quickly choose it. It's a bit of a drive, though. I think I'll get some petrol before we set off, Drew thought aloud to himself, wondering how many miles it would take them to zigzag across the country. Firestone had its own garage, with a simple pump sat on a small forecourt. The garage was a large cold stone building that sat behind the pump, with trees hanging over it from behind. The building had a large door with flaking red paint peeling from it. Drew pulled up at the pump, running over a black lead that trailed away into the building. This caused a distant bell to emit 2 pings and announced to the proprietor, Gerald, that someone had arrived. He appeared through the door moments later, wearing overalls the colour of which was difficult to distinguish through the dense layer of oil that had accumulated on them. "Morning, Drew," he called to them with a wave as he approached Drew's window. Drew wound it down. "How much you after?" Gerald asked. "Might as well fill it up, Gerald, thank you," Drew replied. "Right you are, son." Gerald took the pump and began filling Drew's Zephyr. "I'll get this, Drew. I don't wish to impede on the force's budget if I can help it." The inspector took out his wallet and removed £3 notes. "If you insist, sir," Drew replied, pleased not to have to pay. "Gerald certainly has a well-stocked yard," the inspector noted, admiring the premises. Various car parts were lined up against walls, presumably awaiting a home inside one of the cars that sat inside the garage. A pile of tyres stood just inside the door, and "Good Night Midnight" floated out from a radio somewhere inside. Parked on the road by the pump sat a powerful-looking tow truck. "Yes, he's a busy man, being the only garage in town," Drew told him. Gerald had filled the tank and made his way back to Drew's window. £2.06, he told Drew, who handed the inspector's crisp, clean notes over to Gerald's blackened, oily hands. "Thanking you."